The river lies behind everything in St. Landry Parish, like a debt you forgot you owed. You don't see it from the cane rows, but you feel it, in the way the ground breathes under your feet on wet mornings, in the way the air tastes of iron and old wood when the wind comes from the east. Odette Boudreaux stands at the edge of her husband's field in the gray 5 o'clock light, her boy Rémi still sleeping in the house behind her, and she watches the cane move. It moves the way water moves when there's no wind, which means the ground is shifting underneath. Henri has been dead 11 days. The store ledger says she owes $43.60, which is more than Henri made in a working year, which is impossible, which is exactly the point. The cane moves, the river breathes. Odette does not yet know what she is going to do. The morning Henri was buried, his mother Célestine sat across the kitchen table from Odette and said a thing that Odette has been turning over ever since. The way you turn a piece of cane peel to find the sweetest side. A woman who is seen by the wrong people, Célestine said, is already half caught. She meant it as warning. She'd watched it happen to her own mother, who had a talent for dyeing cloth, and showed it too openly to a trader who came through in 1868. And the trader had found a way to make the talent into a debt, and the debt into a chain. This was how it was done. You had a thing, a skill, a plot of land, a name people trusted, and someone who held ledgers found a way to put a number next to it. And then the thing wasn't yours anymore. Odette had nodded at the table and thought about it from every angle. Now she thinks it means something more than Célestine intended. Not just, be careful who sees you. Also, to be invisible is a kind of power, if you choose it yourself. The question the story will keep asking is whether that kind of power is enough, and what it costs the people around you when you decide to disappear. Henri Boudreaux died on a Saturday, which the parish priest said was a mercy, because it meant he could be buried by Sunday, and the soul could rest clean. Henri would have laughed at that. He wasn't a cruel man about religion. He attended Mass. He crossed himself when thunder came. He kept a small cedar figure of Saint Isidore above the door of the tool house. But he had a quiet skepticism about institutional comfort that he'd passed to Odette not through argument, but through the long practice of their marriage, which had been built on the premise that what you could not see clearly, you should not trust too quickly. What Henri had been able to see clearly in his last months was the ledger at Turreau's plantation store. The store sat at the road's head, a wide porched building with a corrugated tin roof and a smell of turpentine and brown sugar that was not unpleasant from the outside. Theodore Turreau himself was rarely there. He had a house in New Orleans and came out to the parish 6, maybe 8 times a year to look at things and make adjustments. The daily work was handled by his man, Félix Cormier, who was lean and precise and wrote in a hand so small and controlled that the ledger columns looked, from any distance, like the legs of insects. Félix had a gift for arithmetic, and an even greater gift for the kind of arithmetic that produces results you cannot quite dispute because the numbers are all there, in ink, in columns, and yet the total at the bottom does not match the life you have been living. Henri had borrowed $17 in the spring of 1890 to replace a mule that died of colic. This was a fair debt, documented, signed by Henri's own hand. By November, the debt had grown to $29. By April 1891, when Henri's lungs began filling with fluid that no poultice touched, it was $38. By the time Henri was buried, it was $43.60. Odette had not bought anything on credit since November. She kept her own figures in a brown paper notebook she hid inside a flour sack, and her figure said the debt should have been, at most, $19 after interest. She brought her notebook to Félix Cormier on the third day after Henri's burial. Félix looked at her figures for slightly longer than he needed to look at them. Long enough to understand them, she realized, which meant he already knew what they showed. And then he set the notebook on the counter between them and pressed 2 fingers to its cover, as though taking its temperature. "These don't account for carrying fees," he said. "What are carrying fees?" "Fee for carrying the debt month to month. Standard." Henri never signed anything about carrying fees. "It's in the original agreement, Mrs. Boudreaux, the terms." "I'd like to see the original agreement." He found a paper that had Henri's mark at the bottom and a block of printed language at the top, in type too small to read comfortably. He slid it across the counter and watched her read. She read slowly and carefully. The word carrying did not appear. The word fees appeared once, in a clause about late payment. She was not late. "This doesn't say what you say it says," she told him. Félix retrieved the paper. "I'm sorry you see it that way." He said it with the specific gentleness of a man who is not sorry at all and knows that being gentle about it makes the not sorry harder to name. "The debt stands at $43.60. You have 30 days from Henri's passing before it transfers to the estate, which I understand is the property and the tools. After that, it becomes a matter for Mr. Thoreau and the sheriff." She took her notebook and went home. Rémi was in the yard when she got back, crouched over a line of ants with the focused, generous attention he brought to small things. He was 7, brown-skinned and serious, with Henri's long fingers and her own habit of going quiet when something troubled him. He did not ask about Félix Cormier. He had learned, in the strange schooling of his father's illness, not to ask about things that made his mother's mouth go flat. She fed him rice and beans, let him sit on her lap while she read to him from a primer she'd found at the church's small lending shelf. His reading was ahead of where it should be, which was a source of quiet pride she kept even more carefully hidden than her accounting notebook. And then she put him to bed and went back to the kitchen and sat with her 2 notebooks, the brown paper one with her figures and a smaller one Henri had kept that she'd found in the toe of his Sunday boot. Henri's notebook was harder to read, his handwriting having gotten shaky in the last year, but the figures were meticulous. He'd been documenting Thoreau's overcharges for 18 months. He had names, 3 other families in the back settlement, Creole and black families all, who he believed were being carried through the same ledger manipulation. He had dates and amounts. He had, in the last entry, written something that stopped Odette cold. "See what is in the tunnel below the Levee road crossing, 3rd marker south. I left it there when I knew I would not be coming back." She had not known about any tunnel. That was Henri, careful, methodical, secretive in the way of a man who has learned that sharing a plan before it is ready is the same as having no plan. He had found something. He had hidden something. He had trusted that she would be the one to find the note. She sat with both notebooks for a long time in the kitchen. The lamp oil was low. She let it burn down all the way because she did not want to move. Outside, the cane moved in the dark, which meant the ground was breathing, which meant the river was thinking. She thought alongside it. The notice arrived on a Tuesday, delivered not by the post, but by Eugene Fontenot, who was the closest thing the parish had to a deputy when the actual sheriff was occupied elsewhere. Eugene was not a bad man. Odette had known him since childhood, had eaten at his mother's table, and the discomfort with which he held the paper out to her told her he knew what it was and did not like being the one to bring it. She read it on the porch while Rémi pressed himself against her side, sensing something. The notice was from Thureau's store. It stated that the outstanding balance on the estate of Henri Boudreaux, deceased, had been referred to the office of the parish sheriff for collection in the amount of $43.60 plus so-called carrying fees for the previous 4 weeks, assessed at 60 cents per week, totaling $2.40, bringing the present balance to $46 even. It further stated that in the absence of payment in full within 14 days, the estate, itemized as 1 structure residential, approximately 1 acre cultivated land, 1 set iron plow equipment, 1 smokehouse structure, and sundry household goods, would be held as collateral against the balance, subject to seizure. 14 days. Odette read it twice. She noted that the balance had jumped from $43.60 to $46 in the interval since she'd stood in the store, days in which she had not borrowed a cent, in which nothing had been purchased, in which the only thing that had moved was Félix Cormier's pen across a page. Eugene was still standing on the path below the porch steps. He turned his hat in his hands. "I'm sorry, Odette," he said. "I truly am." "I know," she said. She folded the paper. She looked at Rémi, who was watching Eugene with the careful, watchful expression of a child who is learning something about the world that he did not want to learn. "Go inside, baby," she said. "Start the fire for breakfast." He went. She stood on the porch alone and thought about tunnels. She could pay. That was the first thing she ran through, because you had to run through it honestly before you could dismiss it. She owned the house and its contents, Henri's tools, the kitchen goods, the 2 quilts her mother had made, the primer she'd bought for Rémi's reading. She could sell everything portable and take what the house itself might bring on a fast sale. Clémentine Arsenault had been wanting the property for her son. She'd said as much to Henri 2 years ago. But fast sales to neighbors who knew you were desperate brought one price, and that price was not $46. It might be 20. It might be 15. And then she and Rémi would be in the street with nothing, which meant taking work at whatever terms were available, which in St. Landry Parish in 1891 meant sharecrop terms on Thureau land, which meant a new ledger, a new number at the bottom, a new set of carrying fees on a debt that would grow the way the last one had grown. She could go to New Orleans. Henri's cousin Bastien had a place in the Trémé, a small house he rented rooms from. He'd written twice since Henri's death with genuine offers of help, the kind of offers that didn't make you feel like charity. She could take Rémi and the 2 quilts and get on the first boat and be in the city in 2 days. Bastien would take them in. She would find work, laundry perhaps, or cooking, since she was a better cook than most people she'd met and had long suspected this was a marketable thing. Rémi could go to school in the city. There were schools. There were churches that ran them, and the Trémé had a community with enough standing to protect its own in ways that a back settlement farming widow in Saint-Landry could not protect herself. But the notebook was in Henri's boot. That was the thing she kept returning to. Henri had spent 18 months building something, documentation, evidence, a record that could, in the right hands, mean something for the 3 other families being rolled through the same ledger machine. He had hidden it because he understood that it had value precisely in proportion to its secrecy. If she left for New Orleans, Thureau's men would come through the house in a week. She had no doubt of that. Seizure notice or no, they would come. And they would find the notebook in the boot, or they would not. But either way, whatever Henri had left in the tunnel at the 3rd levee marker would sit there unknown, and the 3 families would go on being bled, and she would be in the Trémé pressing other people's shirts, and the knowledge would calcify inside her into something she'd have to live around for the rest of her life. She could go to the sheriff. She almost laughed at herself for thinking it. The sheriff of St. Landry Parish was a man named Aldebert Savoy, who had a horse and a deputy and a practice of playing cards on Friday evenings at Theodore Thoreau's house in the settlement, before Thoreau moved to New Orleans full-time. They were not close anymore, she believed, but they had been close enough for long enough that presenting Aldebert Savoy with a brown paper notebook full of figures that accused Thoreau's store of fraudulent carrying fees was the kind of thing that went one way. She thought about what Celestine had said. A woman who is seen by the wrong people is already half caught. She thought about Henri's last entry. See what is in the tunnel. On Wednesday, she told Rémi they were going for a walk along the Levee road. He was cheerful about it. He was cheerful about most things that involved movement and the outdoors, having Henri's physical ease without Henri's tendency to brood. He wore his good shoes because the path was muddy, and he carried a stick he found at the edge of the yard and used it to measure things: the height of the cane, the depth of a puddle, his own shoulder. He was 7, and the world was still a place that yielded to measurement. She counted levee markers. They were old iron stakes driven into the berm at intervals, their numbers worn but legible. 1, 2. Third marker south of the road crossing, Henri's note had said. She almost missed it. The entrance was overgrown, not with cane, but with the coarser vegetation that grew at the levee base, tupelo shrubs and water oak saplings, and a thick skirt of sedge grass that had been undisturbed long enough to forget anything was behind it. But she pushed the grass aside with her foot and found the concrete lip of what had once been a proper entrance. 2 feet wide, lined with old poured concrete that had cured to a gray-green, with a wooden door so warped it had fused to its frame, but opened, when she pulled hard, with a sound like something peeling away from itself. The air that came out was cool. Not cold, cool, the way a root cellar is cool, which is to say, steady, earth-controlled, the temperature the ground keeps to itself beneath the reach of seasons. Rémi pressed beside her and looked in. What is that? It was for levee inspection, she said. Men used to walk through and check the berm from inside. They don't use them anymore. She had learned this from her father, who'd worked levee crew in his youth. The tunnels were built after the flood of 1874, and most of them had been sealed or forgotten. This one had not been sealed. It ran level and dry about 40 feet, and at its end there was a widened chamber. An inspection station, she guessed, where the crew foreman would have stood with his lamp and his report sheet. The walls were concrete. The floor was packed earth, dry as clay pot. The air moved very slightly, which meant it breathed from somewhere, which meant it would not foul. And on the floor of the chamber, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord in Henri's careful knot, was a parcel. She looked at it for a long moment. "Mama," said Rémi, "it's dry in here." "Yes," she said, "it is." She picked up the parcel. She thought about the 14 days. She thought about New Orleans. She thought about the other families. She thought about what it meant to choose your own invisibility rather than have it chosen for you. "Can we come back?" Rémi asked. She looked at the space. 40 feet of tunnel, a dry chamber, cool air, earth walls that had held for 17 years, a door that looked like nothing from the outside. "Yes," she said, "we're going to come back." She told Rémi everything that night, because he was 7 and serious, and because Henri had always said that keeping children in the dark was a way of teaching them that the dark was where you went when things were hard, which was the opposite of what you wanted to teach. She sat him at the table with his cup of chicory milk, and she said, "The store says we owe money we don't owe, and if we don't pay in 14 days, they will take the house." She said, Your father found something important before he died, and he hid it, and we need to go look at what he hid. She said, I have an idea, but it means we're going to live differently for a while. He listened the way he listened to his primer, with focused, unsentimental attention, tracking each piece before taking the next. We'd live in the tunnel, he said. Not live, work. The tunnel stays cool and dry, which means certain things keep better there than they do here. And if we make things in there, good things, things people need, we might be able to get enough together to buy us some time. Enough time for me to figure out what to do with what your father left us. What did he leave? I don't know yet. She had not yet opened the oilcloth parcel. She had been saving it for reasons she couldn't quite name. Maybe because opening it felt like the last conversation with Henri, and she wasn't ready for that to be finished. But I'm going to find out. Rémi drank his chicory. He looked at the door, then back at her. Can I bring my stick? He said. She almost smiled. You can bring your stick. The oilcloth parcel, opened on the kitchen table after Rémi was asleep, contained 3 things. The first was Henri's second ledger, a more complete version of the brown paper notebook, running back 2 full years, with additional entries she had not seen, including, in careful columns, records from families he had spoken to directly. The Trosclair family, the Melançon, a widow named Armentine Fontenot, who was no relation to the deputy. Each family's overcharge was itemized by month. The total across all 4 families, run across 24 months, came to $212. The second thing was a letter, folded 4 times, addressed in Henri's hand to a name Odette didn't recognize. Mr. C. Dufresne, New Orleans, Carondelet Street. She did not open it. She set it aside carefully. The third thing was a torn page from what appeared to be Turreau's actual master ledger, not Felix's running book, but the master, which Odette had never seen, which was kept in Turreau's back office and never shown to customers. The page covered 6 months of accounts for her settlement and showed, in Turreau's own hand in the right margin, a notation next to each family's account, a small symbol, like a closed circle with a line through it. She sat with these 3 things for a long time. The B story, she would understand later, was not about bread. It was about Henri, who had been building a case from his deathbed, and about whether she was the kind of woman who could finish what he started. The wild yeast was Henri's mother's knowledge, passed down through the specific intelligence of women who had learned to make things from very little, and had encoded that learning in gesture and smell rather than in writing, because writing could be taken. Célestine had shown Odette the starter culture when they first married. A clay crock of flour and water that had sat on a warm shelf in Célestine's kitchen for so long that it had developed a personality, sour and funky and vigorous, the kind of alive thing that required feeding and attention and rewarded both. Odette had kept her own version going since 1885, feeding it scraps of flour and the occasional spoonful of cane syrup to keep it energetic. The cane syrup was the local variation. The sugars in it fed the wild yeast differently than plain water did, producing a longer, more complex rise and a crust that browned more deeply and kept longer. She carried the crock to the tunnel on Thursday morning, wrapped in a cloth, with Rémi walking ahead carrying the stick and a lamp. She also carried 20 pounds of flour in a cloth sack, 4 quart jars of cane syrup she had put up in the fall, salt, 2 flat stones she'd selected from the creek bed for their flatness and heat holding, and a small iron grate salvaged from the ruined chimney of a neighbor's smokehouse. The tunnel chamber became, over the next 3 days, something she had not planned but should have expected, It became a kitchen. The walls were concrete and would not catch. The floor was packed earth, safe for a small fire built in the iron grate, the smoke drawing out through the far end of the tunnel, where a crack between the concrete and the levee earth let air move. The flat stones, heated over the fire and then cleared, served as baking slabs. The chamber's constant cool kept the dough from rising too fast, which meant a slow ferment, 12 hours, sometimes 16, that developed flavor no quick-risen bread could match. The first loaf she pulled off the stones was not beautiful. It was dense at the center and too dark at the crust and slightly salt-heavy. She gave half to Rémi, who ate it without complaint and asked for more. The second loaf was better. The third was right. She stood in the cool tunnel chamber with a third loaf cooling on the stone and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 weeks. The specific, unsentimentalized satisfaction of being competent at a hard thing. It was not happiness, exactly, but it was what happiness builds on. By the end of the first week, she had a system. The starter lived in the tunnel, where the consistent temperature, she estimated it at about 62 degrees Fahrenheit, which she confirmed by feel against her inner wrist, kept it from over-fermenting in summer heat or going sluggish in cool spells. She fed it every morning with a ratio she had worked out through 2 failed batches, 1 part fresh flour to 1 part water, with a half-spoonful of cane syrup. It ate reliably. It doubled in 4 hours, which told her it was healthy. The mixing happened in the tunnel too. She had brought down a large crockery bowl that had been Henri's mother's, deep and heavy, with a slight glaze crack along one side that had never troubled its function. She mixed by feel. Celestine had taught her that a dough is not ready when it looks right, but when it stops fighting your hands, when it shifts from a resistant thing to a cooperative one. And she let the mixed dough rest in the cool chamber for a long, slow fermentation. 14 hours became her standard. Overnight, mostly, with the tunnel holding the temperature so steady that the dough behaved the same way each time, which was the closest thing to precision she had available. She made 3 things. The bread was the foundation, a round loaf about 2 pounds, with the crackled crust that the stone baking produced, and an interior that was chewy and sour, and kept for 4 days without souring further, which was remarkable in the Louisiana summer. She figured her material cost per loaf at about 4 cents. Flour, salt, the yeast she maintained for free, the syrup in tiny quantity. A loaf of comparable bread at Two Road store cost 12 cents. This calculation, performed in her head the first time and then written carefully in her brown paper notebook, was the number that changed everything. The preserves were the second thing. She had put up 8 dozen jars the previous fall. Fig, mayhaw, muscadine grape, and a cane syrup-sweetened blackberry that Henri had called the best jam in the parish, with the uncritical enthusiasm of a man who loved his wife and also simply had good taste. Most of the jars had been destined for Thoreau's store, sold on commission at terms that left her about half the retail price. She pulled them from the shelves and brought them to the tunnel and reconsidered. If she sold directly, to neighbors, to the people who traveled the Levee Road, to anyone who would come to her rather than to the store, she got the full price. 12 cents a jar for the blackberry, 10 for the fig. The third thing was the cane syrup fermentation product that she had not intended to develop, but discovered by accident in the second week. She had left a jar of syrup mixed with water and a scraping of the wild yeast culture uncovered overnight in the tunnel, meaning to use it as a starter feed the next morning. She forgot it for 2 days. When she found it, it had bubbled actively and produced something that smelled both sharp and sweet, a complexity that made her cautious. She tasted it with one finger. It was a vinegar, not finished, not fully soured, but moving that direction, with a sweetness behind it that the fermentation hadn't yet consumed. She thought about it for a day. Then she put a cup of it into a batch of preserves instead of lemon juice, which she had been using to balance the sweetness. The result was something she didn't have a name for. It was not sweet jam, and it was not pickle. It sat between them, the cane syrup providing a depth that citrus didn't, the wild fermentation giving it an edge that was interesting rather than aggressive. She put it on a piece of bread and gave it to Rémi. He ate it. He looked at his hands. He said, "Can I have more?" She made 6 more jars that week. Rémi had become, by the second week, a genuine collaborator rather than a child being minded. He was too small to knead dough effectively, but he was exactly the right size to manage the fire. Small enough to squat comfortably in the low-ceilinged part of the tunnel near the grate. Patient enough to keep it steady. Interested enough in its behavior that he developed a feel for when the stones were at the right temperature without being told. He also had, it turned out, a good palate. He couldn't articulate what he tasted the way an adult could, but his reactions were reliable. If he ate something and went quiet, it was right. If he ate something and made a particular face, not distaste but concentration, something was missing. "It needs more something," he said of the second batch of the cane syrup condiment. She thought about it. "Salt?" he tasted again. "Maybe. And also the other thing." What other thing? He couldn't say. She went through possibilities, the syrup ratio, the yeast amount, the time, and eventually realized that the difference between the first batch and the second was the wild herbs she dropped in by accident the first time. Dried stems of some creek bank plant she'd swept in with the blackberries and not noticed. She went back and found them, wild basil, dry and almost scentless but still present. She added a pinch to the third batch. Rémi ate it and went quiet. "That's it," he said. She labeled those jars differently. She wrote on the cloth cover, "Boudreaux's cane syrup relish." She wrote it in her best hand. The question of how to sell without being visible was the problem she had expected and the one she found the most interesting to solve. She could not open a stall. She could not set up on the Levee road with a cart, because that required a license from the parish, which required presenting herself to the same office that administered Turreau's collection claims. She could not approach Turreau's store, obviously. She thought about the church, which had a small sale of works after the Sunday Mass, where women brought sewing and preserves. But the church was too public. Too many people who would wonder where Odette Boudreaux was getting her flour. The flour question was the first real obstacle she hadn't foreseen. She had 2 20-pound sacks remaining from before Henri's death. At 3 loaves a day, she would go through them in about 3 weeks. After that, she needed more flour. And flour came from Turreau's store. And going to Turreau's store meant Félix Cormier and the ledger. She solved the flour problem in a way that taught her something about how informal economies work when formal ones fail. Madeleine Trosclair was one of the names in Henri's notebook. Her family was being carried through the same fee structure, had been overcharged by Odette's calculation $41 over 2 years. Madeleine was a wide, quiet woman in her 50s who kept chickens and a kitchen garden, and who had, before the ledger trouble began, driven a wagon to the market town of Opelousas twice a month to sell eggs and produce. She still made the drive, but had stopped buying flour at the Opelousas market because the price had gone up and she was trying to economize. Odette walked to the Trosclair place on a Tuesday morning with 2 jars of the blackberry jam and a half loaf of bread and her brown paper notebook. Madeleine met her at the door without surprise. The back settlement women had a way of knowing when a neighbor was coming that had nothing to do with announcement. And they sat at the kitchen table, and Odette explained her situation without hedging. The debt, the tunnel, the bread, the math. Madeline listened. She ate a piece of the bread with jam. She looked at the notebook. $41, she said quietly. That's my accounting. Henri's. I can show you how he got there. I don't doubt it. Madeline was quiet for a moment. What do you need? Flour. I need 20-pound bags from Opelousas, not from Turow. I'll pay you the Opelousas price, fair, when I have it. And I'll give you bread. 1 loaf per 20-pound bag, every run. Madeline looked at the half loaf for a moment. 2 loaves, she said. Not greedily, the way a person states a fair price. 2 loaves, Odette agreed. They shook hands across the table, and the informal economy of the tunnel began. Madeline also, without being asked, became the distribution channel. She knew people. Not in a social, frivolous way. She knew them the way a woman knows people when she has been selling eggs to them for 20 years. She knew who bought what. She knew which households would pay 12 cents for a jar of something good without asking too many questions about its origin. She knew the 2 families of trappers on the backwater side of the settlement who ran goods between the settlement and the market town by pirogue, and who would, for a modest cut, carry parcels without manifests. Within 2 weeks of the handshake with Madeleine, Odette had 8 customers. Within 3 weeks, she had 14. She was making 12 loaves a day, working in 2 shifts, the mixing and the overnight ferment, and then the baking in the early morning before the sun made the tunnel uncomfortable. Rémi managed the fire. She kneaded, shaped, scored, baked. The stones never fully cooled between batches. She stoked the grate, cleared it, baked, stoked again. Her arms ached in a way she had not felt since she was a girl helping her mother with wash. A deep ache in the forearm and shoulder that was not pleasant, but was not unpleasant either. The body's acknowledgement of work done at capacity. The money came in slowly and then faster. Not in large amounts, never more than $1.50 in a single day, but steadily. She kept a new account in the brown paper notebook. Income on the right, expenses on the left. She paid Madeline for flour. She paid the trappers their cut. She bought salt in bulk from a dry goodsman in the market town who had no connection to Turow and no interest in her business. After 3 weeks, she had saved $4.80, which was not $46, but was something. More importantly, the word had spread in the precise, underground way that words spread in a community that has learned to talk around the edges of things. Other women came to the tunnel, not to buy, to learn. Celestine's daughter-in-law, Marguerite, who was from a different parish and hadn't grown up with the wild yeast tradition, came on a Thursday afternoon and watched Odette work and said almost nothing for 2 hours, and then asked 3 precise questions that told Odette she'd understood everything. She left with a small portion of the starter in a jar and instructions for feeding it, and a promise to buy flour from the same Opelousas source. Armentine Fontenot, the widow named in Henri's notebook, older than Odette by 15 years, a composed woman who had survived things she never discussed, came on a different day and sat in the tunnel chamber and looked at the walls and said, "Henri told me about this place the last time I saw him. He said you would figure it out." Odette stopped working. "He told you?" "He told me he'd married a woman who was smarter than him, and that he was sorry it had taken him 10 years to say it to her face." Armentine looked at the parcel oilcloth, still folded on the shelf where Odette had set it after removing its contents. "He said you'd know what to do with the letter." The letter. Odette had been circling it for 2 weeks. Mr. C. Dufresne, New Orleans, Carondelet Saint. Henri had written it. Henri had addressed it. Henri had not sent it, either because he'd run out of time or because he'd been waiting for something. The right moment, the right amount of documentation, a corroborating witness. Who is Dufresne? She asked. Armentine folded her hands in her lap. A lawyer, a colored lawyer from New Orleans. He handles civil complaints. I don't know if he handles this kind, but Henri thought he might. Odette thought about the letter for the rest of that day, while she baked and Rémi kept the fire and the tunnel smelled of bread and old earth. On the 14th day, the deadline day in the seizure notice, Félix Cormier came to the house. She was not at the house. She had been at the tunnel since before dawn and had come back to wash and change and make Rémi his breakfast. And she was at the table with her cup of coffee when she heard boots on the porch and then the knock. Félix was alone. He wore his store apron over his shirt, which meant he had come as the store's representative, officially. She opened the door and looked at him. The deadline is today, he said. He said it without pleasure, which she noted. I know. Mr. Toureau has asked me to make a final offer as a courtesy. He said courtesy the way she said carrying fees, with a careful absence of feeling around a word that was doing something other than what it appeared to do. If you sign over the house and the acre and take the tools in fair trade, the debt is cleared. You'd have the tools to start fresh on a labor arrangement. A labor arrangement. She knew what that meant. It meant sharecrop terms on Toureau land, with a new ledger, a new Félix Cormier, a new set of carrying fees. I don't want a labor arrangement, she said. The alternative is the sheriff in 2 days. I understand. He looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, she thought, but with the specific look of a man who wants to not know something he already knows. Mrs. Boudreaux, he said, and stopped. Yes? He opened his mouth. He closed it. He put his hat back on, which he had removed when she opened the door. I'll tell Mr. Toureau you declined, he said. Thank you. He left. She watched him go down the path and turn onto the Levee road and become, with distance, just a shape against the cane. She went back inside, drank the rest of her coffee, washed the cup, and went back to the tunnel. She had made, in the tunnel notebook she kept separate from the accounting, some calculations about the letter. Henri had addressed it. He had written it. She had read it by then, had let herself read it on the 10th night when she could no longer justify waiting. It was a careful, formal letter, 3 pages in Henri's careful hand, explaining the situation, the overcharges, the families affected, the documentation he had assembled. It asked Mr. Dufresne whether a civil complaint was possible. It explained that the complainants were colored families in a rural parish, and that the documentation was solid, but the access to courts was, to put it plainly, not. It was a good letter. It deserved an answer. The problem was that sending a letter to a lawyer in New Orleans required going to a post office, which meant showing herself, which meant the letter could be noted. She had not been willing to risk it while the seizure process was active. But Félix Cormier's visit today had clarified something. The process was going to proceed regardless. Staying invisible had bought her time and money, but it had not bought her safety. The seizure would come. The question was whether she would have anything to counter it with when it did. She decided, in the tunnel, between the 2nd and 3rd loaves of the morning, that she would send the letter. She decided she would send it with Armentine's son, who was 19 and made the run to the Opelousas post office every 2 weeks for his mother, and had no visible connection to Odette Boudreaux or the Toureau store dispute. She also decided, that same morning, that she was going to approach the other families directly. She had been waiting to do this, waiting until she had more money, more time, more certainty about what the letter to Dufresne would produce. But Felix's visit had shortened the horizon. She needed allies who knew what she knew, and she needed them soon. Madeleine Trosclair she already had. Armentine she had. She made a mental list. 4 families in Henri's notebook, herself included. 3 to reach. 2 she had. 1 remaining. The Melançon family, who lived at the far back of the settlement, who she knew least well, who Henri had noted were the most heavily overcharged of all. She shaped the 3rd loaf of the morning, scored it, slid it onto the hot stone. She listened to it crackle. "Mama," Rémi said from near the fire, "can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Are we going to have to leave?" She looked at him. He was watching the fire with his usual focused attention, adding a thin piece of fuel exactly when it was needed, which she had not taught him. He had figured it out by watching. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm trying to make it so we don't." He nodded. He added another piece of fuel. "The bread is good," he said, as though this were a relevant fact, which it was. "Yes," she said, "it is." Outside the cane was still. No river breath yet. The morning was very quiet. The flood came on a Sunday in July. It did not come the way floods in books come, with dramatic warning and rising dread. It came the way real Louisiana floods came in those years, which is to say, the river made a decision upstream, 3 days earlier and 40 miles north, and by the time the decision arrived in St. Landry Parish, there was nothing dramatic about it, only water where there had been ground, quietly and with complete indifference to the things standing in it. The Levee road flooded first, then the field access paths. By Sunday noon, the back settlement was an island. 5-6 inches of warm brown water over the low-lying ground, which was most of the ground. Boats could not reach them. The settlement road, normally accessible to wagon, became impassable. The families on higher ground, the Trosclair place, the Fontenot place, were dry on their porches. The families in the lower plots, the Melançons among them, were in water to their ankles inside their houses. Odette stood in the tunnel entrance. The berm was high ground, above the flood line, and watched the settlement fill, and understood that the situation had changed entirely. The tunnel was now the driest, most stable structure in the back settlement. It was also secret. Revealing it meant revealing what she had been doing in it. The bread operation, the preserved ledgers, the network of women and trappers and flour runs. Revealing it meant giving up the one advantage she had built in 5 weeks of invisible labor. Not revealing it meant leaving people in water while she stood on dry concrete 20 feet from where they needed to be. She looked at Rémi. He looked back at her. He had, she noticed, already picked up his stick. The Melançon house was in 18 inches of water by Sunday evening. She knew because Armentine's youngest, a girl of 12 named Josephine, who was nimble enough to move through the settlement's high ground paths, came to the tunnel berm at dusk with the information and a frightened face that she was working to control. Lucille Melançon had 3 children under 10 and a mother-in-law who was bedridden. Émile Melançon was trying to build a platform of boards to keep the old woman off the floor, but did not have enough boards and the water was still rising. Odette made her decision in approximately the time it took Josephine to deliver this news, which was less than 2 minutes. "Go back and tell Lucille to bring her children and her mother-in-law here," she said. "Tell her there's a dry place. Don't say more than that yet." Josephine went. Odette went into the tunnel and began moving things, the flour sacks to the highest shelves, the ledger materials to a raised corner where she'd built a small wooden shelf for exactly this kind of contingency. Not floods, but moisture. The crockery bowl she set on the shelf beside the ledgers. The starter crock she wrapped in a cloth. Rémi helped without asking, moving things with a quiet efficiency that made her heart do something complicated. Within an hour, the Melançon family arrived at the berm entrance. Lucille, steady and exhausted, with a 6-month-old on her hip and 2 children behind her holding hands. The mother-in-law, Mamie, 80 if she was a day, walking with a cane and with the dignified expression of a woman who has been through worse. And Emile, who was a large, silent man and who ducked into the tunnel entrance and stood in the chamber and looked at the shelves and the grate and the cooling bread loaves and said nothing for a long moment. Henri built this? He said finally. Henri found it, Odette said. I built what's in it. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Recognition. Recalibration. He nodded once. Over the next several hours, the rest of the decision unmade itself, which is how she thought about it later. She had decided to keep the tunnel secret, and then the flood simply made that decision unavailable. Madeleine Trosclair appeared at the berm with her daughter and a neighbor family, the Beausoleil girls, who had elderly parents on the low ground. Armentine came with Josephine. By 10 o'clock that night, the tunnel held 14 people and was warm with body heat and smelled of bread and earth and wet clothing, and the decision about secrecy was academic. Odette kept the door propped a hand's width and cleared the far end crack of debris so the air would keep moving. When they lit the grate, the smoke rose and slid out instead of pooling. For the children's sake, she hung one quilt as a screen at the tunnel's far end and set a chamber pot behind it, with a rule as strict as any prayer. It went outside at first light, emptied into a shallow trench on the berm, and covered with fresh earth. She fed everyone. There was bread. She had baked that morning without knowing it was the morning before a flood, which meant there were 8 loaves on the shelves. She sliced them and passed them around with blackberry jam and the cane syrup relish and the fig preserves. Mamie Melançon ate her piece of bread with the relish and made a sound that Odette would think about later. Not pleasure exactly, but a kind of cellular relief, the body recognizing nourishment made with care. No one asked directly about the ledger materials on the shelf. She had covered them with a cloth, not trying to hide them, but not announcing them either. The night was not the time for that conversation. The flood sat for 3 days. On the first day, she baked. On the second day, Madeleine and Lucille helped her bake. On the third day, all 3 of them baked, and Mamie Melançon, from her sitting position against the tunnel wall on a folded quilt, directed operations with the authority of a woman who had made bread in harder conditions than a well-lit concrete tunnel. Your ferment is running long, Mamie said on the second morning. It's the extra warmth from the people, Odette said. 12 hours, not 14, and less syrup. The heat speeds the yeast. She was right. The loaves from the adjusted batch were better. The children, after the first night's fear had passed, treated the tunnel as an adventure, with the extraordinary adaptability of children who have been told clearly what is happening and why. Rémi guided the younger ones through the tunnel's 40 feet as though he owned it, which in some sense he did, pointing out the crack that vented the air and the marks on the concrete wall where the old inspection crew had scored the tally of their visits. He taught the Melançon girl, Celeste, age 8, to manage the fire, which she took to with the same focused intensity he had. Émile Melançon did not talk much, but on the second day, he came and stood beside Odette while she shaped dough and said, without preamble, Félix Colmier came to our place in June. I know, Henri's notebook. He was quiet for a moment. How much did he say we owed? $61. He made a sound that was not a word. My figures say you should owe 22, with interest. She looked at the dough in their hands. Henri's figures match mine. What's in those? He gestured at the clothed shelf. She had been deciding this for 3 days and found that the decision had again made itself without her assistance. She took the cloth off the shelf. The ledger materials were there. Henri's detailed notebook, the torn master ledger page, the letter to Dufresne, now copied in Odette's hand, the original sent 3 weeks earlier via Armantine's son, no reply yet received. Also, the accounting notebook, with its running totals of the tunnel's income. She showed Emile the notebook. He read slowly, following Henri's handwriting, and she did not rush him. He talked to Armantine, he said. He talked to everyone. He had a plan. He didn't finish it. Emile looked at her. You're finishing it. She didn't confirm or deny this. She pulled the cloth back over the shelf. But the conversation had happened, and it was like the loaves on the stone. Once started, you couldn't unstart it. On the third night, with the water beginning to recede from the lower ground, Odette called what she thought of privately as a meeting, though it began simply as everyone being awake at the same time, which was itself remarkable and which she took as a sign. 14 people in a concrete chamber. Mamie Melançon on her folded quilt. The children asleep in the tunnel's far end, including Rémi, who had fallen asleep sitting up against the wall with the stick still in his hand. The lamp casting the specific amber light of a flame in an enclosed space, which makes everyone look simultaneously more present and more shadowed. She told them what she knew. She told it carefully, in the order Henri had assembled it. The overcharges, the carrying fees, the methodology, the families affected. She told them the total, $212 across 4 families, over 2 years, extracted through a ledger that said one thing and a master ledger that on the evidence of one torn page said another. She told them about Henri's letter to Dufresne. She told them she had sent it and had no answer yet. When she finished, the tunnel was quiet except for the children's breathing. Armantine spoke first. What does a lawyer in New Orleans do for us if the sheriff is Aldebert Savoie? I don't know. I hope a complaint gets beyond Savoie, to the state level or federal. The federal courts have taken cases. This was not certainty. It was the best she had from her own reading and from what Henri's notebook contained. I don't know what Dufresne will say. I don't know if he'll even respond. But if he does, Lucille Melançon said, if he does, we need to be ready. We need all 4 families willing to put their names to a formal complaint. We need the documentation that Henri built. We need the ledger page. She paused. And we probably need to be ready for things to get harder before they get easier. Because Thureau is not going to let a complaint go unanswered. He'll put pressure on us. He'll accelerate the collections. Emile said, slowly, he doesn't have anything left to take from us. He's already going to take the house. Then you have less to lose than I do, Odette said, and said it plainly, because it was true and they all knew it. She had the tunnel. She had the bread operation. She had a small savings in the accounting notebook, and she had the ledger materials that could, in the right circumstances, mean something. These were the things at risk. Madeleine Trosclair, who had been sitting with her hands in her lap and listening to everything with the patient attention she brought to most things, said, Odette, is this what you want to do, or is this what you feel you have to do? The question landed in her chest in a particular way. She sat with it for a moment. Both, she said. Henri built this. I want to finish it. And I also feel I have to, because doing nothing doesn't keep us safe. It just keeps us invisible. And invisible isn't the same as safe. Celestine told me that. I've been thinking about it for 2 months, and I think she was right. Madeleine nodded. Then I'm with you. The others spoke in turn. Lucille, steady, yes. Armentine, quiet and certain. I've been waiting for someone to do this since 1889. Emile, after a long pause, yes. The flood receded by Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, the Levee road was passable, barely, and the back settlement began the work of putting itself back together. The Melançon family's ground floor had been wet but not destroyed. Emile dried it with the stoic efficiency of a man who has dried floors before. Mamie Melançon, helped back to her own house by Josephine, made it to her own bed and thanked Odette at the door with a handshake and a look that contained several things Odette thought she would be decoding for years. The trouble began on Thursday. Not from Thoreau directly, not yet. It came first in the form of a visit from Deputy Eugène Fontenot, who came to the house on the Levee Road path and found Odette at the porch and held his hat again and said what he needed to say with an evident wish that he did not have to say it. The seizure had been formalized. The sheriff's office had received the filing from Thoreau's store. It had been delayed by the flood. The courthouse was temporarily closed, but it was on the docket now. There would be a hearing in 14 days, at which Odette would have the opportunity to present any defense. If she did not appear, the judgment would be entered by default. A defense, she said. Yes, ma'am, to the debt claim. I have documents, she said. She said it carefully. I have figures that contradict the store's ledger. Eugène looked at her for a moment. You'd want to bring those to the hearing, he said, and the specific inflection he put on want told her something. Told her he knew this was not as simple as she'd stated, that the documents existed in a context where a colored widow presenting arithmetic against Theodore Thoreau's ledger was not the same as arithmetic, but also that he was, in whatever private corner of himself he'd cleared for honesty, telling her to bring them anyway. I know, she said. He left. She went to the tunnel and looked at the shelf. The bread was gone. They'd eaten everything during the flood, which meant she'd need to bake tomorrow. The starter was active. The flour supply, after Madeleine's last Opelousas run, was 30 pounds. The accounting notebook showed $8.40 in savings, which she had not touched. She opened the letter notebook, the one where she'd kept the copy of Henri's letter to Dufresne, and found the page she'd left blank for a reply. Still blank. She closed it. On Friday, a man came to the house who said his name was Arcadien Broussard, and that he worked for Théodore Thoreau. He was not from the parish, his accent was New Orleans, and he was better dressed than Félix Cormier, which told her something. He did not wear an apron. He wore a jacket. He offered her $20 for the house and acre, which he said was generous given the debt, which he put at $46, which meant, he did not say this, but the math was present, that she would end the transaction $8 short and without a house. No thank you, she said. Arcadien Broussard did not look surprised. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. Mrs. Boudreaux, Mr. Thoreau is trying to resolve this without making it difficult. It's already difficult, she said. More difficult, then. I understand. She looked at him steadily. I'll be at the hearing. He nodded. He what? She watched him walk to the Levee Road and turn south, not north, which meant he was not going back toward town. He was going toward the back settlement. She understood what that meant. She walked to Madeleine's house and knocked. Madeleine answered and read her face and said, "Come in," without waiting to be told what had happened. They're visiting the families, Odette said. Emile already got a visit. This morning, Madeleine was calm, offered them $15 to clear the debt and walk away from the property. Emile? Said no. Lucille said it before he did. Madeleine poured coffee without asking. Armentine? I haven't been there yet. I came here first. Armentine will say no, Madeleine said with certainty. That woman has been saying no to things since before we were born. Odette drank the coffee. Outside, the cane was moving again, the deep, underwater movement of a living thing on uncertain ground. She thought about Henri, who had built something carefully and hidden it and trusted it to her. She thought about the blank page in the letter notebook. She thought about the hearing in 14 days and the 17-year-old strip of concrete beneath the Levee berm and the $8.40 in the accounting notebook. She thought about Rémi, who would be home from where she'd sent him, Celestine's, for the day, because she'd known today would not be a day for a child to be near, and who would be back by nightfall and would want his dinner and his reading. I need the letter to reach Dufresne, she said. I sent it 6 weeks ago. Nothing. Maybe it didn't arrive, Madeleine said. Or he doesn't do this kind of work. Or he looked at it and decided it wasn't winnable. She set the cup down. I need a different way into the courthouse. Someone who can file a formal objection to the debt claim before the hearing. Not a lawyer, I can't get a lawyer, but a formal objection, in writing, attached to the court record. If it's on record, it's harder to ignore. Madeleine was quiet for a moment. Father Delacombe, she said. Odette looked at her. He's literate, Madeleine said. He went to seminary in Baton Rouge. He knows how to write a formal document, and he's... She paused, choosing carefully. He's been unhappy about the store for longer than we have. He's said so from the pulpit. Nothing specific, but the feeling was there. You think he'd write an objection. I think he'd write it and walk it to the courthouse himself if you put Henri's notebook in front of him. Odette considered the priest. She had been careful to not involve the church, because the church was visible, and she had been trying to be invisible. But visible was what this phase required. She had already decided that. The flood had decided it, and the meeting in the tunnel had confirmed it, and Arcadienne Broussard's visit today had finished the deciding. She picked up her cup, realized it was empty, set it down. I'll go see him tomorrow, she said. The letter from Dufresne arrived on Saturday. It had been delayed by the flood, the mailboat had been rerouted, and it came in a stained envelope that had been wet and dried and was wrinkled at the corner in a way that made Odette's heart contract with dread before she opened it. She sat on the porch and read it. Charles Dufresne wrote in a formal, careful hand. He thanked Henri Boudreaux. He had not received word of Henri's death for the detailed account. He had reviewed the materials. The documentation was compelling. A civil fraud complaint was, in his professional opinion, viable on the merits. However, and here the letter took a turn she felt in her ribs, the plaintiff would need to appear in person in New Orleans to sign the formal complaint, as he could not file on behalf of parties he had not met and could not verify. Furthermore, given the nature of the defendants and the jurisdiction, he would require a retainer of $25 before proceeding, as the case would likely require multiple filings. $25. She had $8.40. She also had now a seizure hearing in 13 days, a formal debt claim filed with the sheriff, Arcadienne Broussard, visiting her neighbors, no lawyer, no formal objection on record, and $25 standing between her and the one legal avenue Henri had been building toward for 18 months. She folded the letter. She held it in her lap. She looked at the cane field, Henri's field, still producing, still moving in that deep, involuntary way. and felt the specific weight of a moment where the path forward requires more than you currently have, and the deadline is close enough to taste. Rémi came around the side of the house with his stick. He looked at her face. "Bad news?" he said. "A problem," she said, "but I'm going to think on it." She did not sleep on Saturday night. This was not unusual. She had slept badly since Henri died, her body accustomed to his warmth beside her and unable to fully rest without it. But this was a different kind of wakefulness. Not grief exactly, though grief was in it. More like the state of a person who has been walking a long time and has come to a place where the path is obscured, and who must stand still long enough for her eyes to adjust. She sat at the kitchen table with both of Henri's notebooks, and her accounting notebook, and the letter from Dufresne, and the lamp that she let burn as long as it needed. She read Henri's figures again, all the way through. She read her own. She looked at the torn page from Thoreau's master ledger, the one with the small symbol in the margin, the closed circle with a line through it, next to each affected family's account. She had not known until now what that symbol meant. She had assumed it was a categorization of some kind, a notation internal to Thoreau's accounting system. But reading Dufresne's letter and thinking about what he'd said about formal complaint and documentation and multiple filings, something clicked open in her understanding that she had not been ready for before. The symbol was not a categorization. It was a target. The families marked with it were not being randomly overcharged. They were being systematically prepared, their debts inflated to a specific level, a level at which the property they held could be seized under the debt collection statutes without triggering the kind of review that larger seizures would attract. The whole operation was a machine. Thoreau was using the store not to generate retail profit, but to generate land. Small parcels, quietly, from families who couldn't fight back. Henri had understood this. That was what the notebook was. Not just a record of one family's mistreatment, a documentation of a system. She sat with this for a long time. Then she allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to feel the thing she had been working around, the grief, the anger, the specific loneliness of understanding something that the person you would have told first is no longer there to tell. She put her hands flat on the table and breathed through it. She did not cry, which was not because she did not feel it, but because she had learned, in the specific education of the last 2 months, that the feeling and the crying were not the same thing, and she could hold one without being required to do the other. What would Henri do? She almost laughed. Henri would do exactly what he had done. Build the case carefully, document everything, find the right person to take it to, and then trust that the work was good enough to carry itself. He had trusted Odette with the rest, and she had spent 5 weeks being invisible when what she needed was to be seen by the right people, in the right way, on her own terms. Not stumbled across, not exposed, but presented. Here is what we found. Here is what it means. Here is what we are asking. $25. She looked at the accounting notebook. $8.40. She looked at the 12 loaves she'd baked yesterday, still on the cooling shelf. She looked at the window, which was lightening almost imperceptibly toward gray. She thought about the bread. She thought about 14 people in the tunnel during the flood. She thought about Mamie Melançon and the relish and the sound she had made. She picked up the pen. She began a list. By dawn, she had a plan that was not comfortable, but was real. The $25 would have to come from the settlement, from the people who had been in the tunnel during the flood, from the informal economy she had been building for 5 weeks. Not as charity, as investment, which was Henri's word from the notebook. If we file this complaint and it is successful, the fraudulent debts are voided and the collected overpayments may be recoverable. $212, distributed across 4 families. The investment required was $25. She had $840. She needed $1660 more. She also needed to write to Dufresne and tell him Henri was dead and that she was the one carrying this forward. And she needed to get to New Orleans. She was not going to let Dufresne consider this an unknown correspondence claim. She was going to put herself in his office and show him the ledger page and let him look at the symbol in the margin with his own educated eyes. And she needed Father Delacombe to write the formal objection and file it before the hearing, which was now 12 days away. 3 things. 3 days for each, roughly. She looked at the list. She thought about Celestine's words. A woman who is seen by the wrong people is already half caught. And about the counterweight she'd built. That choosing your own visibility on your own terms was not the same as being caught. She picked up her shawl. She woke Rémi. "We have work to do," she said. "Come on." She went to Father Delacombe first, because he was the closest, and because she knew that if she thought too long about any single step, she would find reasons to hesitate. The rectory was a small building beside the white-painted church, surrounded by a kitchen garden that the priest maintained himself with the focused, unceremonious attention of a man who understood that faith and vegetables operated on similar principles. He was in the garden when she arrived, on his knees with a trowel, and he stood and wiped his hands when he saw her coming down the path, and read something in her face that made him say, before she'd spoken, "Come inside." They sat at his kitchen table, the parallel to Celestine's table, to Madeleine's table, to the pattern of this entire story, which had been conducted at kitchen tables. And she opened Henri's notebook and put the torn ledger page in front of him, and said what she had to say. She said it without apology and without minimizing. She said, "This is a fraud. It has been conducted over 2 years. It has taken money from 4 families and is currently in the process of taking their properties. And there is a lawyer in New Orleans who can file a complaint, and I need a formal written objection to the debt claim filed at the courthouse before the hearing." Father Delacombe read Henri's notebook. He read it for 20 minutes, which was longer than she'd expected, which meant he was reading carefully rather than performing the reading. When he finished, he set the notebook down and looked at the torn ledger page for a long moment. "The circle symbol," he said. "You recognize it? I've seen it before. Not in this context," he thought. "It's a common shorthand used in accounting for a claim marked for collection. But here," he looked at the column, "all of these are the same class of account, all colored families, all in the back settlement." He was quiet. "It's a notation marking accounts targeted for escalation." This confirmed what she'd concluded in the dark at the kitchen table. Having a priest confirm it, a man who dealt in documents and had been to seminary and who would stand in the courthouse without the specific vulnerability she carried, was different from knowing it alone. "Will you write the objection?" she said. "Yes." He said it without pause. "I'll have it done by tomorrow morning, and I'll take it to the courthouse myself." He looked at her. "This document, the ledger page, I'll need a copy for the objection. I'll copy it tonight. Mrs. Boudreaux," he folded his hands. "Going to New Orleans. Do you have the means?" "I'm working on the means," she said. She went to Armentine next. Armentine listened to the plan with her characteristic stillness, the kind of stillness that was not passivity, but rather the surface of very rapid interior processing. And then she said, "How much do you need from each family?" "I need $16.60 total from all 3 families combined. Whatever you can manage, with the understanding that the complaint, if successful, returns the overpayments." "What if it's not successful?" Then the money is gone and so is the house, Odette said. She said it plainly. She had decided that transparency was the only thing that made this kind of ask legitimate. Armentine looked at the letter from Dufresne. She looked at the notebook. I have $6, she said. I've been keeping it in the chimney since June. I'll give you 5. Armentine, 5, she said firmly. I have use for the other dollar. From the Melanson family, Émile gave $4, a contribution that Odette suspected represented most of what the family had in cash, with a manner suggesting that not contributing was not something he had considered. Lucille pressed 2 extra jars of her own put-up syrup into Odette's hands along with the money and said, "Sell those if you need the extra." From Madeleine, $6 in bills from a crockery jar she kept on the pantry shelf that she described only as her starting over money, and which she parted with in the manner of a person who has decided that starting over is happening now. Total, $15. $1.60 short of Dufresne's retainer. Odette went back to the tunnel and counted her accounting notebook balance, $8.40. Added to the 15, $23.40. She needed $1.60 more. She stood in the tunnel chamber and looked at the shelves. The relish jars, 12 remaining, the ones she'd made in the 3rd batch with the wild basil. She could not spare all 12, but she could spare 10. 10 jars at 12 cents each was $1.20. Close, 40 cents short. She thought about the 2 syrup jars Lucille had given her. She did not have a price in her head for syrup. Good cane syrup from a family's own pressing, not the commercial grade at Thuroud's store. She thought about what Mamie had said about the relish. She thought about the woman from the north side of the settlement who had sent her son to buy 3 jars the week before and had sent a note asking if there was more. She wrote a price on a piece of paper, 20 cents. She put it on 1 syrup jar and looked at it. 20 cents for a quart of good family syrup was a fair price by any measure. She went to the woman's house that afternoon. The woman bought it without negotiation and asked when there would be more. $24.80. She was 20 cents short. She went home. She baked. She thought. She looked at the primer on the table. Rémi's primer, the one she'd been reading aloud to him each evening. She had bought it at the church lending shelf for 20 cents, and it was technically returnable. She would not return the primer. She looked at her accounting notebook. The loaves cooling on the kitchen counter? She'd baked at the house today, the tunnel having served its flood purpose. She could move back with the operation now that the ground was dry. 4 loaves, each worth 12 cents at retail. She could sell 2 and keep 2 for the week. 2 loaves, 24 cents. Plus $24.80, $25.04. She had her $25. She sat very still for a moment and felt the specific quality of an arithmetic problem resolving. The satisfying final click of a ledger that balances, not by fraud or manipulation, but by counting every real thing carefully. She wrote to Dufresne that night. She told him Henri was dead. She told him she was Odette Boudreaux, his widow, and that she was continuing his work. She told him she had the documentation, the additional family accounts, and the master ledger page, and that she would be in his office on the following Thursday with the retainer. She sealed the letter and gave it to Armentine's son that evening. The next 5 days were the most active of her life. She baked every morning. She kept the tunnel clean and the starter fed. She settled the informal accounts with Madeleine's flour supply arrangement. 2 loaves per 20-pound bag, as agreed, paid current. She coached Émile Melanson through a parallel documentation of his family's account, using her figures and Henri's notebook, so that Dufresne would have a second set of records to present alongside hers. Father Delacombe filed the formal objection on Tuesday. He came to tell her in person, arriving at the porch in the late afternoon with the careful dignity of a man delivering good news that is not yet conclusive. The clerk at the courthouse had accepted the filing. It was on the record. The hearing would proceed, but there would now be an objection on record challenging the debt's legitimacy, which changed the proceeding from a default judgment to a contested matter. The judge who'll hear it is Arsenault, he said. He's not a friend to this kind of claim, he paused. But he's also not a man who ignores written documents on the record. He'll have to address it. That's enough, she said, for now. She left for New Orleans on Wednesday, taking the mailboat south. She left Rémi with Celestine, who had taken everything Odette told her with the composed, devastating quiet of a woman hearing her son's unfinished work described and understanding that it was being finished by exactly the right person. Celestine gave Rémi an extra sugar cake when she thought Odette wasn't watching. Odette was watching. She let it go. Charles Dufresne's office on Carondelet Street was a narrow room above a dry goods shop, reached by an exterior stair that had been patched so many times the patches outnumbered the original wood. His assistant, a young man of about 20, who moved with the compressed efficiency of someone doing 3 people's jobs, showed her in without ceremony, and Dufresne himself rose from behind a desk entirely covered in papers to shake her hand. He was older than she'd imagined, 60-something, light-skinned, with reading glasses pushed up into his hair, and the expression of a man who had been presented with many things over many decades and had developed a fine-grained detector for the quality of each. He looked at Henri's notebook for 12 minutes by the clock on his wall. He looked at the torn ledger page for 3 minutes more. He was very still while he read. The circle symbol, he said. Father Delacombe identified it as a collection marker. It's more specific than that in a legal context. He set the ledger page down. In older Creole accounting practice, New Orleans origin, spreading out through the parishes in the 1870s and 80s, that symbol was used specifically to mark accounts where the creditor intended to proceed to property seizure rather than cash settlement. It's in the published accounting conventions from 1872. He looked at her over the papers. If I can show that Thoreau's master ledger uses this symbol as a systematic marker for seizure-targeted accounts and cross-reference it to the fraudulent carrying fees in the running ledger, I can argue deliberate fraud with intent to dispossess. That's a different legal category than ordinary debt dispute. She had understood Henri's documentation as evidence of overcharging. She had not, until this moment, understood it as evidence of organized dispossession, a planned mechanism, not a series of individual frauds. Can you win it? She said. He was quiet for a moment. I don't tell clients I can win things, he said. I tell them when I think a case is worth bringing. This case is worth bringing. He looked at the notebook again. It should have been brought 2 years ago. Your husband was building something careful. He was sick, she said. He ran out of time. Dufresne nodded. He took the retainer. She counted it out on his desk, the bread and relish and syrup money, and the chimney savings, and Emile's $4, the whole strange assembly of it, and he gave her a receipt, which she folded and put inside her dress. The hearing in your parish, he said. The formal objection buys you some time, but the debt claim will proceed. I need 30 days to file the formal complaint at the state level. Can you hold the local proceeding for 30 days? I don't know, she said. I can try. Father Delacombe, the priest who filed the objection, Can he petition the court for a continuance, citing the pending state filing? I'll ask him. Ask him today. Send him a letter from here before you take the boat back. She wrote the letter in the waiting room on paper Dufresne's assistant gave her, the young man hovering with an ink pot that he kept offering and she kept accepting. She wrote to Father Delacombe in her clearest hand, petition for continuance, cite the pending state-level complaint, request 30 days. She sealed it and paid the postage and dropped it at the post office on the way to the boat landing. The boat ride back up the bayou took most of the day. She sat on the deck in the heat and watched the water go by, brown and heavy and moving with the purposeful indirection of a thing that is not going where you think it is going, but is getting somewhere regardless. She thought about Henri, who had died building something he didn't get to finish. She thought about the word Dufresne had used, deliberate. Not accident, not sloppiness, not the casual exploitation of unequal power. Deliberate, a machine, designed. She thought about the bread. 12 loaves a day, 4 cents material cost, 12 cents retail price, 8 cents margin per loaf, 96 cents a day. In a month, roughly $29. In 2 months, enough to pay any remaining debt if the complaint cleared the fraudulent carrying fees. In 6 months, enough to begin rebuilding what the last year had taken. The math was not poetry. It was not triumph. It was bread. But bread was what held people together when everything else was flooding. The continuance was granted. The state complaint was filed. The hearing, when it finally came 8 weeks later, went for 2 days before a judge who was not Arsenault. Arsenault had recused himself, for reasons that were not explained, but which Father Delacombe described, when he told her, with an expression she read as careful satisfaction. The replacement judge was from Baton Rouge and had no cards-playing history with Théodore Thureau. The outcome was not clean in the way that stories suggest outcomes should be clean. The fraudulent debt was voided. The Melanson property seizure was enjoined. The master ledger was subpoenaed and examined by the court, and the circle symbols were identified in the record as Dufresne had predicted. Thureau paid no criminal penalty. This was 1891 in Louisiana, and the limits of what a civil complaint could accomplish against a white property owner were real and were not pretended away. But the fraud was on record. The debt was gone. The houses stood. Odette stood outside the courthouse with Henri's 2 notebooks under her arm. The court had returned them. And Rémi beside her, holding his stick, wearing his good shoes. The sun was doing what the Louisiana sun did at 4 in the afternoon in September, which was to light everything from a low angle that made even ordinary things look like they had been chosen. She thought about the tunnel. The Levee road was visible from the courthouse steps, a half-mile distant, the berm running along the edge of the visible world. Beneath it, the cool earth breathed. The wild yeast lived on its shelf. The bread would need to be started tonight if there were to be loaves tomorrow morning. And there would need to be loaves because there were people to feed. Ready? Rémi said. She looked at her boy. She looked at the cane. Yes, she said. Let's go home. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you liked the story. If so, please consider giving the video a hype and writing a comment where you are watching from. Your support means a lot to me. See you in the next video.